This is the third year of economic updates that CDC have presented publicly, and as in all of them, we'll focus specifically on the regional economy. So I won't talk about macroeconomic trends and I won't talk about national trends. This will be focused particularly on Christchurch and Canterbury as an economy. So we'll spend some time talking about that. You'll see some themes emerging in the presentation, and we'll try and tie those together at the end, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation. Anybody that's got any questions, we can talk about the detail. It continues to be a really interesting time in the wider economy of Christchurch and Canterbury, and what's fascinating is we're seeing some new themes and we're seeing some old themes re-emerge. So we'll run through the detail, and then at the end of it, as much question and answer as we need and as we've got time for. But if you could keep the questions to the end, please. Thank you. And when you have a question, if you could just put up your hand and somebody will bring a microphone to you so the whole audience can hear, and we'll run it that way. Tori and the team will be bringing microphones around. Okay, so where are we? Steady growth, you could call it a low growth environment, but better than expected. So we've seen the peak of the rebuild. We're now into a steady decline of construction-based activity. At this point, we expected us to be in broadly a zero growth environment. We're not there. Actually, we're still growing, and the long-term trends are more positive than we expected. Now that's hard to understand when you read the paper and hard to understand when you see the commentary, because people focus on growth. So you will see a description of Christchurch and Canterbury as the lowest growth environment in New Zealand, which is true. But what they don't comment on is the fact that it's off record highs of output. So we have never had the regional levels of GDP that we continue to have now, which is extraordinary. Construction impact is decreasing, the underlying economy is picking up the slack. So what we have to remember when people talk about that low growth environment in Christchurch and Canterbury is that we're at all-time highs of output and we continue to grow. I will talk about three main themes today. So the overall economy, we'll have a look at that in detail in the region. Visitors and migration, and why that's been so incredibly important and will continue to be in the future. I'm also going to talk about the government's most recent changes to migration legislation and the potential impact for that. We'll talk about housing a little bit as well, and the housing market, and we'll try and tie it all together at the end around what that means, opportunities and risks. But we have to remember, and it doesn't get commented on, that our overall activity levels in the region are phenomenal. So, low growth environment. We had the stimulus of the earthquake. So first of all, we had the earthquake. We lost a bunch of activity. So our economic levels dropped. We then went into a very high growth environment. As off a lower base, we started injecting all of this construction stimulus into the rebuild. What we're experiencing now is that plateau of very high rebuild activity, where we've got broadly $1 billion a quarter of stimulus flowing into the region. But there's no growth in that now. So that's been there for over a year. It will continue to be there in the future, but actually it will continue to decline. So any growth we get in the economy is now from the underlying economy. And actually it's really important that we understand that, and it's really important that we continue to get that going forward, because in 5 years' time, when the construction stimulus is a lot less than it is now, actually our employment opportunities, the overall health of our economy will be driven by that underlying economy. So the low growth levels that you see there, lower than New Zealand, is absolutely to be expected. It is actually slightly better than expected. So we expect to see growth at zero. We may even see growth negative in some quarters as the construction stimulus continues to fall away. But what's really important is that those key underlying sectors, your manufacturing sectors, your services sectors, your visitor sector. The key employment opportunities in the region continue to expand and grow. And I'll talk about population and migration a little bit later on. So, low growth environment, but doesn't feel like that, off very high base, and key sectors expanding. Unemployment levels. I'll start at a macro level in the region and we'll come down. So unemployment now has risen slightly off its all-time lows and is heading back to the national average. So over time, we expect that to continue. So if you look historically, you'll see that Christchurch and Canterbury historically track very closely to the national average. What happened with the rebuild is we injected all the stimulus and we broke the correlation. So the unemployment market was, the employment market was significantly tighter in Christchurch than it was in the rest of the country, and there was very little unemployment. We still have very low unemployment across the entire region. And what that has meant is that we have needed immigration to fill those employment opportunities. Over time, we expect to see the wider region, including Christchurch City, we expect to see its unemployment track back to the national average. There will be a little bit more volatility in this series. In particular, as the rebuild changes shape and nature, you will see shifts in the construction workforce that will at times alter these figures in a more volatile way than would be normal. But over time, they will come back to national averages and should continue to track that way. This is interesting. Difficulty finding skilled labour. You would think that it would have been harder in Christchurch and Canterbury, given the unemployment environment, given the very tight employment market, that it would have been harder to find skilled labour than the rest of the country. Now, we think there's a specific reason why finding skilled labour continues to track underneath the national average, and we think that's to do with migration. So the Department of Immigration with MBIE, at the height of the rebuild, put in place some very, very clever legislation that was specifically aimed at easing the regional marketplace for employment in Christchurch. So it made it easier to attract an international workforce into our region. Now, we will tell you that piece of legislation has worked brilliantly well. Took the heat out of some of the construction marketplace, actually enabled us to bring workforce back into the region that otherwise it would have been too time consuming or too difficult to attract. So it worked really well. And we can see that now in the fact that given we've got lower unemployment than the rest of the region, our employers are still reporting it as easier to find skilled labour than the rest of the country. It's actually a really encouraging graph. Not without risk, but a really encouraging graph. By the way, this never goes to zero. You always get employers that will say it's hard to find people. Now, some of that is because some employers don't offer enough money, others of it is because potentially they don't have a compelling proposition, and some of it is because they're in sectors where it is very, very hard to find the right skills. Tech sector is just a wonderful example of that, where at the moment there's just huge demand for skills and fundamentally not enough supply. And that's not a Christchurch challenge, that's a New Zealand challenge, and it's an international challenge. So, there's a couple of absolutely stunning numbers on this table. So first and foremost, labour market participation rate. Now, I've talked about this for a couple of years. 69% is the normal participation rate for a labour market in an established Western world economy, and they don't change. They sit at 69%, they're one of those odd parameters that just is what it is. Christchurch has been 73% for 3 years now. When you add to that 4% unemployment, you have very close to zero unemployment, zero real unemployment in the marketplace. So we have 3% more people in the labour market than we would do in a normal environment, and we have 4% unemployment. So it just gives you an idea of the opportunity that continues to exist in the city and the region. Extraordinarily good time in the labour market. The other stat that just jumps out of that table, and I want to talk about it a little bit, is when you take Christchurch out of the Canterbury labour market, Canterbury's unemployment is 2.7%. That is not sustainable from an economic growth point of view. So we have regional towns and centres, and in particular we have an agriculture sector that is relying on people being able to attract migrants because they don't have population growth within their centres. In a lot of cases they actually have population decline and they have a rapidly ageing population. The only solution to that problem is shifting workforce into the regions. Now that means either getting Kiwis to commit to moving from towns into the regions. The trend is the opposite way, so that is a hard sell at an aggregate level, or it is continuing to bring migrants into the regions. So at 2.7%, I will tell you there are economic opportunities being missed in the regions because employers can't get workers. And there is some risk in that statistic. There is also some risk in that statistic when you think about the fact that currently migration legislation has just been tightened. So I will say that all of the major parties in the run-up to an election are looking at tightening migration criteria. That is using national policy to fix an Auckland problem. Right? And it is something that we should be very concerned about in the region because we have a different set of problems to the upper part of the North Island. We're not infrastructure constrained, we haven't got a housing market that's out of control. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And what we have got is an incredibly tight labour market with an ageing population. We need ongoing migration. If we don't, we're going to miss economic opportunities. So working through very carefully with central government how we ensure that we get the right labour market policies for Christchurch, for Canterbury and for the wider South Island is going to be extremely important. This, by the way, this regional employment situation is not something that is just relevant to Canterbury, it is relevant to the whole of the South Island. There are a number of areas where there are either extreme skills shortages or fundamentally just a lack of people. Okay, so on that same trend, 3 years of record migration, wonderful statistic. Changed the diversity, changed the shape of our city and our region, and much for the better. So Christchurch and Canterbury are now multicultural as a city and a region. The beginning of that trend was driven by the rebuild. The last year and a half are not. So over 70% of all inbound migration now is non-rebuild related. So that is returning Kiwis, it is expats, and it is migrants. We've got migration that's running at, broadly speaking, 5 to 6 times what it was in 2005, 2006, which was roughly the long-term average, and we really need that to continue. And I'll talk about why with regard to housing in just a little bit, but the fact is that the economic opportunities in the city and the region need a larger workforce. We're not going to fill it by birth rate, we already know that. We already know what the next 15 years of the workforce looks like in terms of population growth, and the answer is there's not going to be any. There's going to be more people coming out of the workforce than there are going into it. So we actually need that level of growth over the next 15 years just to keep the same number of people in the workforce that are in it today. So how are we going to do that? Actually, we're going to do that through our visitor economy. So this hasn't been well understood till just recently, and we're wrapping our heads around it at the moment, and it is of course part of the thinking around the merger of CDC and CCT and international education and all those things. But your international migration comes out of your visitor economy. And when you think about it, that makes complete sense, because people don't move somewhere they haven't visited. They move somewhere they've visited, where they've had a really good experience and they've gone, gee, that's good, I'd quite like to live there. I wonder if there's an opportunity for me to do that. And there is one group in particular within those visitors where that is true, and that is international students. So the experience our international students have at, in particular, the tertiary institutions in the region, set them up, so long as there are the economic and employment opportunities here, set them up to move here. At a wider level, the flow of visitors into our region and into our city can also be used to help drive long-term migration, to help people to understand what the quality of life, what the balance is that's available here, the city of opportunity that Christchurch represents, as opposed to a lot of the rest of the world. I will talk about affordability when we get to housing, because it is in an area where there is a significant advantage beginning to emerge for Christchurch. But those visitor flows, really important. And what I'd like to do now is just segue into a little bit talking about overall visitor flows, and by that I mean tourism numbers. So we have wonderful levels of tourism flows into the South Island, predominantly through Christchurch International Airport and especially into the region of Canterbury. Christchurch is missing out. And it's missing out because the rebuild is not completed, because package destination behaviours have changed, so that a lot of people fly into the airport and disappear around the South Island and the city doesn't get to touch them. And we are going to have to do a few things to address that. It requires the building of amenity. It requires the central city to be such a compelling proposition that people decide they have to come into Christchurch. They have to stay in Christchurch, they have to spend one, they have to spend 2 nights here, and they need to see all of the things that are happening around the city. Now, by and large, that is in a much better place than you would think when you read the newspapers. So the feedback from people that come into the city is actually extraordinarily positive. So we had the Board of Tourism New Zealand here a couple of weeks ago, and they were blown away by the state of the city. They called it the best famil they'd ever had, the energy, the optimism, the innovation that they could see in the city. They had no idea. And it's that last bit that counts. They had no idea. We're defined by a cathedral situation we can't resolve and a convention centre we haven't been able to get built. And that is how the rest of the country and internationally audiences view us. Because for whatever reason, those two projects have become the definition of the central city. We need to fix that. We need to tell our story a whole heap better. So we need to focus on getting that city of opportunity, all the amazing things that are being done here, the energy and the innovation that is in the city. We've got to start telling that story in a consistent and positive way. Right. And we need to get the convention centre built, which I know we will, and we need to resolve the situation around the cathedral, and we need to get Metro Sports built, because actually it's that program business case of all of the things that the central city will have that make it that compelling destination that mean we can change those visitor flows. So a 10% change in 330,000 people is 30,000 guest nights for one night, is 66,000 guest nights for 2, and that fixes another issue. I'll come back to that slide. Sorry, bear with me. Okay, hotels in the central city. So I've put this slide up before. There is really good levels of committed commercial investment in rebuilding the hotel stock of Christchurch and Canterbury. And a number of those are going to come online in the next 2 to 3 years. I'm sorry, I'll come back to the other 2 slides. There is a little bit of concern out there that the supply-demand marketplace is going to get a little bit out of whack. In other words, that we're going to build all these hotel rooms and then we're not going to have the visitors necessary to keep the yields up to make those look like a compelling proposition. So long as we can get the demand piece right, there's no issue here. In fact, actually we'll need a lot more hotel rooms than we have had previously if we can get this right. The get this right bit is the really important bit. So we know the supply is coming online. We know there's opportunity for further supply to come online with regard to hotels. Actually, what we need is the demand piece that says the visitors that are coming into Christchurch International Airport want to come into the city and stay. So we think we're ready to start telling that story. We think it's time to get far more optimistic around what the city represents. I will tell you that the biggest challenge is going to be taking the city with us on that story. Because we've all been in this since the earthquakes, we're all a little bit tired, we can all see the things that are wrong, and in typically Kiwi fashion we tend to focus on those things that are wrong. We don't see what new visitors into the region experience. We don't see the cool stuff, we don't feel the energy, we don't talk about how Christchurch has changed. We've got to get that messaging right. So we are currently doing a piece of work with a number of other entities around our city narrative and the city story, around telling that story in a cohesive and compelling way. And we think it's time to get that out there. And we think it's time to stand up and be proud of the city again. We have to take the residents with us first. And I will tell you that is going to be the single hardest sell of that exercise. Because they're all like us, they've all been stuck in this and they've all been living it, and it's easy to be a little bit jaundiced. And we've got to find ways to convince them to be positive and to message our city around all of the awesome stuff that's in there. Okay, so I'm just going to flick back. There's some suggestion nationally, potentially with a little bit of justification, that the tourism market is starting to flatten out. And there's also some suggestion nationally that in some particular areas of the country that might not be a bad thing, because we're starting to put our social licence to operate at risk by having too many people in one place. I agree with that, but it's not an issue for Christchurch and Canterbury. With the exception of Tekapo, that has some massive challenges with flows. But in particular for the city, we don't need to be worrying about that. In fact, we need to be sticking our hand up and saying, hey, we want the whole country full and we can take more. There is one really encouraging piece of data around visitors to Christchurch and Canterbury versus visitors to the rest of the country. And that's that people who come here, their spend levels are really good. And actually overall spend continues to climb. So I will tell you that is the future of New Zealand tourism, is attracting higher value spend tourists who bring greater benefit to the economy as a result. And there are some encouraging trends in the region in that regard. He's not here, and you know, I know he'll be insufferable as a result, but Malcolm Johns and his team out at the airport are just doing an amazing job. The direct international connections that they have put in place have been an extraordinary economic boon to the region. So China Southern continuing to increase their passenger numbers into the city has driven a change in the South Island tourism economy that would not have happened if they hadn't pulled that off. So what you are starting to see out of Auckland International Airport, if you notice, is that yields from a whole bunch of routes into Auckland are way down. Yields into Christchurch are not. And that is because the visitor proposition that people see internationally is the South Island. It's just that a whole bunch of them fly into Auckland and then they end up down here. So we have to continue to work on that basis. We have to accept that Air New Zealand's international hub is in Auckland, and that's not going to change anytime soon, and there are a whole bunch of reasons why that makes sense for them. But for us, for Christchurch and Canterbury and the wider South Island, we need more direct international connectivity, We don't need it just for the visitor market, although that's a huge plus. We need it for freight. We also need it for long-term immigration, because one of the key things that migrants look for is that international connectivity, the ability to get back to their family where they came from. So the more of that and the easier we can make it for people to fly out of Christchurch, actually the better it is for our long-term employment market. Okay. I was supposed to go from hotels to construction, but I've kind of bounced around a little bit. Construction activity is now falling. We have seen the peak. We are still at extraordinarily high levels. So what we should not forget is the $1 billion a quarter of stimulus that continues to sit within our economy. But you almost kind of miss it now, A, because we're used to it, and B, because everybody reports on growth rates. So what we have to remember is that we still have this enormous industry, much, much bigger than it is normally, continuing to exist within the city. It will continue to fall over time, so eventually it will go back to its long-term levels. For a period, it may even go below its long-term levels because we've built so much new stock. But long-term, it will return to its long-term sustainable levels. We continue to have this extraordinary level of stimulus, which is creating all of these positive impacts for our economy, both within the city and the region. I would also just like to highlight something, and I'll come back to why. So residential activity compared to long-term averages is still way, way, way above normal. So it's easy to think that the residential rebuild has finished. You don't see it, you're in and around it. There is still an awful lot of activity occurring in the residential marketplace. And I want to talk in a minute about why that's been a very, very good thing, and why going forward there might be a little bit of risk around it. And then I'll come back to migration. Building consenting. So here you can really see that we're well past the peak now, and we're starting to see significant falls, in particular in residential consents. So we expect that to continue, but also what I would like to highlight is that activity level around consents, so this is new activity that is coming into the system. New residential building activity is still significantly higher than it is in a normal long-term environment. So that means there is still a significant pipeline of new residential housing coming online. The commercial aspect of this is going to continue to look lumpy. It's going to continue to go up and down, and that's because commercial projects in their nature are lumpy and tend to be very large. So we will see that continue to go up and down and spike. Over time, it will decline. We'll see some big spikes for the anchor projects, but we will see a gradual lessening of activity, in particular around commercial office space. You will have seen the majority of activity in that space, so that will continue to decrease. All right, housing. And you will notice that over time, the Christchurch housing market has just separated a little from the overall New Zealand market. And actually what that means is it's separated a little bit from the Auckland market, because the Auckland market dominates the New Zealand housing market picture. That is a really, really good thing. So Christchurch's housing stock now, I would characterise as very high quality and relatively affordable, compared to an Auckland situation where I would characterise a lot of it as relatively low quality and unaffordable. So that opportunity for us in particular is around the attraction of workforce. So we've got modern, safe, warm, new build housing at relatively affordable prices. There is still an affordability issue in the city, in particular for the lower paid, but overall, and in particular in comparison to Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, we have a far better affordability situation for our housing stock. That's been a good thing, because if you remember those migration levels, we've had record numbers of people moving into the region. And if we hadn't had that incremental housing stock, we would have seen more of an increase in housing values. And I'll come back and talk at the end about why there's a little bit of risk around house prices just at the minute. Rental levels, exactly the same scenario. So rental stock is now significantly improved from what it was prior to the earthquake. It's modern, it's new build, it's warm, it has lower operating costs than it did before, and it's got less expensive than it was at the peak of the rebuild. We think there's probably a little bit more to go in this, in terms of we think those prices will continue to fall a little bit, and that's because there is still an awful lot of supply coming on in the rental market. So there are a lot of properties being built that are intended for rental. Now that will be okay if our population continues to increase. But we already know that there's some construction workforce that will leave, and if migration was to dry up because of the tightening of the legislation around migration, then we do potentially risk a little bit of an oversupply in both the equity markets and the rental markets. So remembering the activity levels that we looked at, we know there's a lot of housing still to come on stream. So if demand was to flatten, you can probably estimate that with greater supply, prices may come back a little bit. If demand was to fall, in other words, we continue to have loss out of the construction industry, which we will have, and we weren't continuing to replace that with migration, which is what we've been doing, then we could see a little bit of a more challenging marketplace in housing emerge. Now, for those of you that were here 3 years ago, you will remember that we stood up and predicted that, and pretty much every developer in the city threw rocks at us. We talked to the Reserve Bank about this. We were bang on the money back then. We're on the money now. These things always occur at the tail. So they're always at the end of a boom is where you see your potential oversupply emerge. The underlying economy will support population growth in Christchurch and will continue to support population growth in Christchurch. So long as we can convince the people to come here, we will continue to see population growth in the city, and we will see it soak up that extra supply. But we need to have the right legislative levers to encourage that. And continuing to tighten migration for us as a region puts that at risk a little bit. Okay. These are key sectors. I will race through this. Key point to highlight in here is that you can see construction, the size of the workforce in construction is starting to fall. That is a good thing, and it will continue. So we will not need a construction industry of the size that it has been throughout the peak of the rebuild, and we will see it start to continue to shrink. I would just like to highlight one other sector, and it's a big and key one that doesn't have the right visibility in the city, and that's manufacturing. So manufacturing is a vital piece of the economy for Christchurch and Canterbury, and you look at that and say, oh, its workforce has fallen by 1%. It has, but the sector itself is incredibly positive. And the reason it's incredibly positive is that there are productivity gains being had in parts of that sector that are offsetting the employment situation. Also, manufacturing is a very large range, everything from low-cost commodity manufacturing, which is a very, very difficult space globally because you're competing with the likes of China and Taiwan and the major low-cost manufacturers, all the way through to this incredibly buoyant high-tech manufacturing sector in the city that is just doing some amazing things at the moment, where you are seeing significant levels of growth. So very important sector for us, very important for the long term that manufacturing continues to do well in Christchurch. Services sector, which covers off a whole heap of things, actually incredibly positive. Strong growth in that sector, people thinking that is going to continue, and actually a very positive outlook. All right, I'm going to finish on projections, and then I'm just going to finish with a little summary, and we'll take any questions. So, what do we think is going to happen? We think unemployment across the region is going to continue to rise towards the national average. we think unemployment in the region outside of Christchurch is going to continue to remain incredibly tight. And to fix that may need to be that salaries will need to increase slightly. Absolutely will be that migration needs to continue. Net migration, we're in uncharted waters with the legislation that's been put in place. We don't yet understand what the impact of it is, but we think there will be one. So we think we're going to come off the record highs that we've been achieving. We have been saying that for a year and a half now, and it hasn't happened. But we do think migration will start to slow, and we do think that the legislative levers will be a bit of a brake on it. GDP growth, still positive, still in that 0 to 1% range, which is low, but again, off those historic highs of activity levels. And finally, we will start to see, and this will continue, some decrease in the construction activity on a quarter-by-quarter basis, and that will continue. I am just remembering, I'm sorry, there was one stat I didn't talk about in a table earlier, which was employment growth in the region in the last quarter, which was 3.5% against the national average of 5%. So that national average of 5 is an extraordinary number. There's probably no one else in the Western world economy that is achieving that. 3.5% employment growth in Christchurch with a construction industry that is starting to contract is extraordinary and an incredibly positive sign of the positivity and confidence in the underlying economy. So look, what I'm going to finish with is I'm just going to suggest that we are in a very strong set of economic conditions that we probably don't talk about enough or recognise, and the rest of the rebuild stimulus continues to give us this fantastic opportunity to make sure our underlying economy is in the right place, so that when it finishes, we're just on a growth path that's going to run for the next 15 to 20 years. Okay, thank you very much, and very happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really excellent summary, really very, very good, and I wouldn't disagree with a word of it. Where does the Christchurch story come in terms of the big picture for Christchurch and the demonstration of Christchurch as a city of choice, not only for people outside New Zealand, but people inside New Zealand? Historically, we had strong internal migration, and it seems to me that everything is set up for continuing strong internal migration, except we're not telling the story.
Completely agree. And we will start telling the story. The reason the story is so important is it's a slightly more complex story than Auckland. So let me give you an example. Auckland, it's really easy to run your story because you just stick a job ad out there and you say it's $150,000. And people don't understand that $150,000 won't get you very far at all if you're a single income family living in a $1.5 million house with a mortgage of $1 million and no disposable income. And you're going to take 2 hours to get to work and an hour and a half to get home, and that's not counting a Friday when it takes you 3 hours if you're lucky because of the infrastructure problems that exist. The sell in Christchurch is the comparison, is the cost of high quality affordable houses, is the fact that it takes 30 minutes to get from the commuter areas, let alone town, into the central city. The new build of the central city, the quality of life you can have here because it's an hour to the ski field and 20 minutes to the beach. So that city of opportunity, those pillars of grow, connect, have balance, getting that story out regionally, nationally, internationally, it's just key. So you are going to see that messaging starting to come out. Thanks, Peter. At the back.
Tom, just from what would be the message to the education sector, particularly secondary schools?
That the world's changing really fast, and keeping up with that is key. Look, the message to secondary schools is that there is an extraordinary opportunity on the doorstep here, and engage with your tertiaries, which I know you do, and your employment sector around those opportunities. So manufacturing, just as the best example, really significant economy in Christchurch, and a lot of cities don't have it. We do, and we could do a much better job of thinking through pathways into that sector. Look, I will also say we are extraordinarily lucky with the tertiary institutions that we have in this city. So anybody that hasn't been for a walk around UC or doesn't understand what is happening in the school there and what that university is going to be as a result of its rebuild needs to go and have a look, because it's going to be special and going to be a magnet for students, both nationally and internationally. And as a city, we absolutely need to start thinking about leveraging that.
Tom, you've talked about the kangaroo farm, but you haven't touched on agriculture. Whereabouts do you think as a region we're heading with our agricultural development and growth over the next?
We are actually diversifying a lot more than people give us credit for, but there's more needed. So the answer is not more dairy. The answer lies in the reliable and sustainable use of water to grow different things. And then once you've grown them, to do a lot more value add here before we ship them offshore. So a lot of you will have heard me say we do dumb soft commodity exports better than just about anywhere else in the world, and we catch a cold on it better than just about anywhere else in the world. So we have to get better at value add production, at capturing more value than just at the farm gate. And that's what I would really like to see over the next 15, 20 years. I will tell you, I think the ecosystem is in place, and I think that is starting to happen, but there's still more we can do.
Tom, you mentioned earlier about immigrants' key source being from the education sector, which you just touched on. But are we focusing on the right sort of education in Christchurch to attract the right sort of immigrants that we want? Is there more that we can be doing in that area?
Look, I think so. The reality of getting people to shift here is that the first thing you have to have is the right employment opportunity. If you haven't got the right employment opportunity, you're not going to attract people here. The quality of life can be fantastic, but if you're not doing anything, it's probably not going to work. So the underlying economy needs to be in a really strong state, and then we need the right pipeline, in particular out of our tertiaries. Look, I actually think that program is working better than it has done in my entire time at CDC. I think there's better engagement between the tertiaries and the business community, and I think there's better understanding of what the flows look like. So I think it's in a good place.
Tom, you talked about Cantabrians not being so good at being our own self-promoters in an environment where we really could deserve to be. I'm interested to know what do you think is stopping Cantabrians in doing that, and what actions need to be taken in the next year or so to ensure that we market our own region?
I think it's part of our DNA. I think it's part of a lot of Kiwis' DNA, and it's something we need to get over. We have to get more focused on attraction and promotion, and we've got to get more optimistic about the story. The first thing that needs to happen is the content needs to come out. So the content has been missing to create that consistency of message. We're working on that. So get the content out to give people the ability to tell the message, and then we've got to convince people to be great messengers. So this is actually something Auckland did brilliantly well. They really smashed this. They got the taxi drivers, they got the potential promoters of the city, and they invested time and effort in teaching them the story and getting them to tell it. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but 10 years ago when you jumped into a cabin at Auckland Airport, the first question the guy asked you was, when are you leaving? Now, most of the taxi drivers can tell you the major events program that is running in Auckland for the next month. And all of them will have suggestions on where you should go. So we've got to actually get smarter about the way we distribute our messaging, and a little bit more sophisticated. So to be fair, the content hasn't been there for us to be able to do it, and also the city and its people haven't been ready. We think that's changed. We think the city is ready. We think we've got a story we can tell. We need to convince the populace that they're ready. Then we need to give them the content and get them positive and get it out there. Word of mouth, social media, what people say will be far and away the strongest messaging.
I think one of the biggest problems we've got of residents in Christchurch, probably residents in the whole of New Zealand, is that they don't realise that tourism and hospitality doesn't just affect hotels and restaurants and bars and things like that. Everyone in some way has some benefit out of tourism in New Zealand, because it's the butcher, the baker and the candlestick maker that get supply all these hotels. We've had fantastic news this year of cruise ships coming into new cruise wharf coming. All those things add up a hell of a lot of money. People from overseas or visitors that come here spend more money per head than locals do. And it's enormous. It's about 5 or 10 times more. So if we can get people to realise that everyone benefits out of tourism, benefits out of a visitor strategy that you're doing, will be the better.
Yes. Jim.
Put quite an emphasis on that being important to underpin the economy going forward. But my question really relates to the value in which markets you see we should be chasing to, get the yield from.
I think it's more about proposition than market. I'm very definitely not a fan of all your eggs in one basket. You catch cold that way, as our basic soft commodity exports experience will tell you. So a distributed strategy that is absolutely focused on the right end of the market rather than a particular geography would be the way I would go. There are some key growth markets, absolutely, and China, no question, is one of those. But only having Chinese tourists in the New Zealand economy is not the answer. It's more about what's the type and nature of tourists that we want rather than where they come from.
Thanks for that informative briefing, Tom. Transport. I want to applaud the Christchurch City Council for the leadership and boldness in the investment in the cycle lanes and infrastructure. I think it's fantastic for the future of our city. But I'm interested, you've talked about a lot of these figures and facts, and I'm interested in the view on the challenges facing our transport network and what your view is on this, given you're obviously very pro-migration, bringing more people into Christchurch. What does that mean for our transport network? We don't want a lot of people, cycling's not for everyone, there's a lot of people who go by car, and there's already a pressure on our infrastructure. There's people who are facing long commutes out from Waimak and various places to come into town. So I'm interested in your views on what are the challenges facing us in our transport network, and what are some of your advice or thoughts around how we can approach and deal with these things. Thank you.
Gee, I could do a whole nother presentation on that. Disruption in the transport industry is going to be very interesting. So what do autonomous vehicles mean? And they are coming. What does that mean for the transportation space? But let's run an assumption, which I think is safe to say, that that's still a little bit further into the future. What does more population growth mean for the city in terms of transportation? Well, if everybody moves out to the suburban commuter belt, it's going to put pressure on that. But they don't need to. So you have the East Frame coming online, and I think that potentially is a very important housing solution for the city. You have now, so people don't realise this, but the population of Christchurch City is now back above what it was prior to the earthquakes. Population of Greater Christchurch is now about 30,000 people more than it was prior to the earthquakes. But there is an opportunity to have people relocate back into the CBD. So what you're seeing emerge now is a more normal market around supply and demand, and commuting time and commuting challenge is absolutely a very big part of that marketplace. So if you can walk to work, which is absolutely possible in terms of some of the solutions that are starting to emerge in Christchurch, that's a big plus for a part of the market. So without going into the whole transportation challenge, and it is a significant one over the next 25 to 50 years, the choice of having people closer into the city and removing the congestion issue and the commute issue, and at the same time helping to stimulate the CBD, we see that as a really big opportunity.
So we live in Central City, lived there for 13 years. We lived there pre-earthquake, obviously. And what we're seeing the market deliver in terms of accommodation in Central City is small, very, very small apartments. And I just wonder, you know, you're talking about the opportunity of people moving back into the city. If people come and live in New Zealand, if people come and live in Christchurch, do they want to live in one of these very small apartments? Is the market delivering what people want?
Great question. And actually I can give you a little bit of data on this. So for Christchurch residents, the answer is no. They prefer a little bit of extra space. For international migrants, the answer is yes. Because what we define as a small apartment, they look at and think is luxury, compared to Singapore or London or Hong Kong or some of those really extreme markets. So we haven't seen it yet, and what I will tell you is the market will determine it. So if the demand is there, I think it will get built. If people build things where the demand is not there, guess what? They won't get used, or they won't have the right pricing structure. So it's only been very recently that the Central City has represented a compelling proposition, or has started to represent a compelling proposition for people to choose to live. It's really interesting. The demand for, in particular, high-end apartments in Christchurch has been very high. The more questionable one is the affordable apartment sector of the CBD, which absolutely we need to be thinking about. There's a challenge here. Affordability and size are directly related. The bigger the size, the less affordable.
Do you believe we're missing an opportunity to build the new green economy city? Is that an opportunity we should be focusing more on?
Gee, there's so many opportunities out of the rebuild. Green economy is absolutely one of them. I actually think we're not doing bad. And that's because of the scale and quality of the new build that is going on. So we have made significant steps in energy conservation, in more modern buildings and technology. Are we perfect? No. And potentially have we optimised it? No. But we could have done worse as well. The green economy, the sustainable economy, the disruptive economy, the innovative economy, everybody talks about them as opportunities for Christchurch, and they're all right. The question has got to be is that overall, when people look at us, have we made the most possible out of our opportunity, and have we done the best that we can to get it right for the next 50 to 100 years? We're not there yet, but actually we're doing a lot better than people comment on. This city is going to be amazing. Just got to start telling that story. Thanks guys. Coffee afterwards and a bit of a yak for anybody that wants it.